Can everyone? Yeah, I hope everyone can hear me now. Yes, thank you. And hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This is our second seminar talk on the Digital Gandhara project. Nice to see you here. I would see this as a gathering of all Gandhara art lovers. I would like to greet you good morning or good evening for wherever you are. And I'm Chai, a postdoc in Howard CAMLab. Yeah, I would like to welcome you to CAMLab seminar talk. Today's speaker is Dr. Alexandra Wallin. Yeah, let me introduce our today's seminar speaker. She is a operational manager function from 2005 to 2012 in the French archaeological mission in Bamiyan, led by Professor Fauzi. And she is specializing in Afghan Buddhist archaeology and sustained a thesis dedicated to the archaeological and iconographic study of representations of scenes from the life of Buddha and Buddhist imagery in the art of Hada in Afghanistan at Satrapur University in November 2011 and got the title of Doctor in Antiquity Science. She also contributes in building a Hada database, which you can access through the website is hadaarchaeodb.alexandrawallin.com. And most importantly, she is our academic advisor in CAMLab. She is highly participating in our ongoing project on Hada reconstruction, which has been destroyed during Soviet invasions. And you can have a look on our preliminary model on one of the sites, which is Tapesoto. I hope you can see my screen. Yeah, which is Tapesoto of Hada reconstruction. And in this seminar, Dr. Wallin is going to present some ideas on her research on aesthetic and iconography borrowing of characters from Buddhist legend from Hellenistic characters, appropriation and transformation of identity. Well, during the talk and after the talk, you may post a question on the question box and Dr. Wallin will have a look on it. For those who prefer to listen the talk in Chinese, feel free to change your audio channel to Chinese. 我们的讲座同时提供中文同传翻译，有需要的听众可以从 Zoom 的语音频道转换为中文。Okay, well, now without further ado, Dr. Wallin, whenever you are ready, the stage is yours.
Many thanks for this presentation. I'm gonna share my screen. Is this okay for you? Yes, we can see. Yes, first of all, I wanted to express my gratitude and thanks to Professors Jean Wang and Shai Liu for their invitation. It is for me an honor to join the CAMLab team as academic advisor and to contribute this wonderful work of rebuilding Gandhara monasteries. And I am really delighted to participate in the CAMLab seminar and to share this talk with you today. As already mentioned, I have been working on Buddhist archaeology of Gandhara since 2012, notably on its iconography. And I conducted a PhD on iconographical study of the Sangharama on Ada, and I worked on the excavation of Bamiyan under the direction of Professor Maria Laitarsi. As you are aware, during the earlier centuries of Christian era, the territories of northwestern India, the current state of Pakistan and Afghanistan, have developed along the Silk Road a branch of Buddhist art with complex and fascinating aesthetics and stylistic characteristics, the art of Gandhara. This sacred art, in the service of the geography of the Buddha Shakyamuni, is pluralist. It results of various artistic influences, notably local, Indian, Central Asian, and Hellenistic across Asia Minor, Middle East, and Persia, and result of peculiar execution and iconographic specificities according to the region where it developed. I have chosen to dedicate this intervention to foreign influences in Gandharan art and more precisely to the borrowings from Hellenistic art. These borrowings are not a total assimilation, a fusion, confusion as the phenomenon of interpretatio Graeca Romana, this propensity of the Greeks and Romans to assimilate foreign deities to their own deities. Obviously, never as a Western character being identified by Gandharan artists or devotees with a character from Buddhist legend. As we shall see, these Hellenistic iconographic figures are most of the time stripped of their original identity in order to represent characters from Buddhist tradition. What aspects then are involved in this borrowing and how this tells us about the way artists perceive the foreign models, what they saw in them, what they retain and what they did not, what motivated their aesthetic choices. I will present some representative cases, each of which could be the subject of a whole talk, trying to understand what elements determine the Gandharan artist to choose the features of or style of such and such Hellenistic character to represent such and such a Buddhist mythological figure. In short, to understand what are the mechanisms of this appropriation and transformation of identity. I am about to draw numerous parallels between Gandharan art and Hellenistic works, deliberately chosen from both the Greek and Roman worlds without entering into the confrontation of theories concerning the origin of the Hellenistic component in Gandharan art, which has always been debated for a century. In establishing this comparison, I do not claim at any time that they are direct imitations. We do not have the time here to go into the detail of this long history of contact, but in few words, as far as our subject is concerned, the contact between the West and Gandhara continues since Alexander the Great at least until the Roman period, and the contribution of the intermediate kingdoms from Asia Minor and Middle East to Central Asia is undeniable and must not be forgotten. Let's start this review with the examination of the tutelary couple famous in Buddhist art, the genies Penchika and Ariti, whose appearance in Gandhara has been strongly influenced by Hellenistic iconography and aesthetics. These figures have been the subject of detailed study, notably by Bashofer, Fouché, Fredericks, Quagliotti, Chandra, Tanabe, and many others. Here are some illustrations showing the progression of the representation of this couple from its most Indian aspects to its most Hellenizing aspects. Ariti, the mother of demon, was originally in ancient Indian tradition a deviless Yakshini, an ogress devourer of children, symbolizing childhood diseases. The Buddha himself is said to have once converted Ariti into a helping deity. This is how she becomes the protector in children in Buddhist legend. If previously she was able to steal them, to eat them, she can now grant them. She has become a child giver, a patroness of children, and by analogy with her male companion, a dispenser of fertility, fecundity, and wealth. In accordance with her mythology, Ariti is represented in the iconography surrounded by children. It is a complex character, on some circumstances equivalent to Shri and Ardosho, which has been particularly studied by Quagliotti and Tanabe, to name but a few. On this sculpture, Ariti is seated with her foot on a stool, dressed in a flowing tunic, an uttariya placed on the shoulders, and wearing an elaborated dress, a woven crown decorated with a flower and topped by a palmette-shaped elbow. At her feet, even on a stool, children crowd around. Another, lying on her lap, grabs a necklace. On this other representation, children stand out on Ariti's shoulders, one of them dressed like a little Buddha. A third one, which she holds on one arm, clings to her naked breasts. On these two reliefs, the headdresses, clothing, and jewelry are purely in the Indian tradition. The companion of Ariti, Panchika, is the genie of richness, fertility, well-being, and wealth. As his consort, he assumes several identities and is, in some cases, equivalent to Kubera and Vaishravana. It is most of the time represented like a rich monarch with a purse, a cup, often in guardian stance with a spear, a scepter, a staff, often wearing a tiara. He can take on a paunchy appearance. On these schist reliefs, Panchika is seated with his foot on a stool, holding a spear. He is bare-chested, pot-bellied, dressed in the Antaravasaka and wearing an ornate turban decorated with cabochons and jewels, long earrings with several rows of pearls and necklaces, all in typical Indian style. He too is accompanied by children pressed around him to reap its benefits. On this sculpture, the tutelary couple is seated on a throne. They are both in a relaxed position, seated with their foot on a stool. As previously, Panchika is dressed in the Antaravasaka, wearing an elaborate turban. Ariti wears a flowing tunic and ornated dresses, and they are surrounded by children. One of them, lying on the lap, grabs her necklace. Another spring up between their heads. The headdresses, clothing, and jewelry are here too in the Indian tradition. Here are the same ones in the same posture as their iconography begins to become Hellenized. Panchika has lost his good-naturedness and his roundness. He is even skinny. The stools have disappeared, even if you remember the position with his foot in the air. He leans on his spears and holds a bag or a purse on the other hand. His clothes have also changed. He is dressed in a fitting tunic, ending at knees, and boots. What appears to be a cloak tied at the shoulder level can be seen. Ariti is dressed with a chiton tied under the chest. The children have disappeared, and instead, the one in her arms, she's holding the horn of plenty, or cornucopia, a Hellenistic symbol of fertility, richness, and prosperity. Panchika and Ariti appear here in a strong Hellenized guise. Panchika, dressed in a short tunic and boots, holds a cup. Ariti is dressed in a very fine drape, almost transparent, leaving one shoulder uncovered, tied on the forearm in a sleeve. She carries a cornucopia lined with foliage and overflowing with fruits. Following Indian tradition, a child is still grabbing his knee, but he is now alone, and both the styles and drapery are entirely Hellenistic. Even the child usually emerging between their heads has been replaced by Vajrapani brandishing the Vajra. This development leads to representation of Ariti in their most Hellenized form. Here we can see Ariti was wearing a chiton tied under the chest, a wavy hair framing the face and falling over the shoulders from a bun on the top of the head, ending in a curl of hair. Her expression, half open mouth, expressive eyes, is like the style of Western inspiration. A strong Hellenistic heritage is revealed on the Ariti in the guise of a Greek ticket discovered during the excavation of Nijvi II of the Peixotor of Ada, conducted by Professor Tarzi. The scene represents the first sermon. The center is occupied by a monumental Buddha, while other figures are standing on a low bench, leaning against the side walls. monks, tutelary guardian, deities, and donors. And on each side of the Buddha, the bottom corners of the niche were featured two particularly interesting protagonists, Ariti and Vajrapani, which we will examine later. A torso pivoting to present a free and a face turned to the Buddha, she raises her right hand to throw flowers toward him. Her left hand holds a cornucopia, again lined with foliage and overflowing with fruits. She is dressed in a talar chiton, a long chiton tied under the chest with a belt, and a cloak that covers her legs and comes up over her shoulder, passing over her back. According to Tardi, the theme of this woman is that of the Greek Tike. More precisely, its antecedent is found on the Greco-Bactrian coins of Amintas from the Kunduz treasure, where the goddess holds a cornucopia seated on a throne. In niche V2, she lends her type to represent Ariti, deity of abundance and fertility, here in a position of orant, of a genie with flowers. Of course, some part of the Indian iconography, the children, has been removed and replaced by the Greek symbol of fertility, the cornucopia. Nevertheless, it is remarkable to notice that, as if in compensation, the artist had added a purely Buddhist context by giving Ariti the attitude of genies throwing flowers. What does it teach us? The guardian couple's appearance, as well as that of Ariti alone, was metamorphosed. Panchika has lost his good-naturedness and his warrior attribute, the spear, is neglected for its richness attribute, the purse and the cup. However, there is no replacement or borrowing, as these attributes were already associated with him before. His clothing and aesthetic rendering, however, bear the Hellenistic mark. As for Ariti, her acolytes, the children, are replaced by the Greek symbol of fertility, the horn of plenty, the cornucopia of Tike. In the same way, its clothing and aesthetic appearance have been inspired from this character. The connection between the two protective figures was clearly made by analogy in the symbolism of their attributes. Is it possible that Panchika's appearance was subject to Hellenization because of its proximity to Ariti? It can be assumed that the artist would have been faced with an aesthetic incoherence if he had tried to create a relief where Ariti was Hellenized and Panchika not. Nevertheless, I do not think the reason is here, as in other cases, artists have mixed of different style and artistic inspirations together in the same spaces. Gandharan artists seem to have chosen to borrow from the appearance and clothing of a Hellenistic king to figure Panchika by analogy of function of dispenser of wealth and richness. Let us note finally that despite the transformation of their look, the iconography of Ariti and Panchika still highlights the respect of sovereignty, fruitfulness, and wealth. Let us now turn to the complex character of Vajrapani, whose nature and identity is still under discussion, and with some general consideration about this character. Vajrapani has been the subject of many studies, many examinations. To list just a few names, let us mention Oldenburg, Sénart, Fouché, Busagli, Lamotte, Frédéric, Santoro, and more recently, Tanabe, Bechtel, and many more. Among the protective and worshipping cohort accompanying the Buddha, one place of honor is reserved for Vajrapani. It seems that every devotee, and particularly exceptional men, were lent deity born at the same time as him, innate and charged with accompanying him constantly throughout his life. Most of the time, he seems to be just an impassive spectator. The rest of the time, he appears as an obedient servant, holding the flycatcher or helping the Buddha with various tasks. The first scholars to study Vajrapani noted that his type remained undecided, sometimes birdless and chubby, sometimes mature or old and bearded. They assumed that this was due to the absence of physical description in the ancient texts. In some, indeed, these teach us that he is called Vajrapani, literally the Vajra bearer, and as his name indicates, that he holds a weapon, the Vajra lightning. The scholars suppose that this lack of description was the reason why in arts he take on the physics of local and foreign deities or heroes by turns. We will come back to this problem later, but before, let us start our examination. Here are some representation of what we can call an undefined formal Gandharan type of Vajrapani. On these two scenes representing the first summon, Vajrapani appears with a young, unbodied, and not specifically defined type, as figures are quite formal. He wears the same monastic clothes that the monks in one cases, the Uttarasanga who let the shoulder uncovered in the other. His physical appearance is similar to the monks, except he has hair while they are shaved. What identifies him is its undefectible attribute, the Vajra. This instrument takes the form of a sort of double pestle, rounded at the end and often with edges. On this relief representing the homage of King Nagakalika and his wife Suvarna Prabhasa to the Buddha, Vajrapani takes the appearance of some local donor or warriors, as can be seen from this example of Ada. The look is that of a mature man with shaved chin and mustache. His hair is straightened in round curls that fall in twists, framing the face. These second reliefs show an older type of Vajrapani, maybe inspired by Brahmans, wearing a long and straight beard. Whatever the reason, the lack of specific description and undefined age and appearance made indeed Vajrapani a particularly suitable subject for borrowing. Under Hellenistic influence, he takes on the figure of Zeus, Heracles, of Bacchus or Satyr, even Hermes, Eros, or Hellenistic heroes or kings, as we shall see. Here is the first example of a Hellenistic-inspired Vajrapani, holding the flycatcher in his right hand and the Vajra at chest level with his left hand. He is dressed in a short curved tunic inspired by the Greek exomid with a buckled collar, leaving one shoulder uncovered. His face has a serious expression and is framed by voluminous curls of hair. He has a mustache and a short beard. This appearance is inspired by a Hellenistic deity. In parallel, this marble statue of Zeus, but I could also have compared it to a Poseidon, the male Greek deities sharing this physical type with an opulent and wavy beard and hair. On this example, the rendering of the clothing and face are strongly inspired. The aesthetic rendering, however, does not bear the Hellenistic mark to any great extent. On this relief representing the visit to the Kaishapa, another Vajrapani borrowing his appearance to Zeus. As previously, he is brandishing the fly swatter and carrying the Vajra resting on his left hand. He is almost naked, only his legs are covered by a drapery going up on his arm. This time not only the face, but the body rendering are inspired by the Hellenistic sculpture. Here is the famous Doryphoros of Polykleitos, and we notice the Gandharan artist's attempt, which we may find more or less successful, to render the anatomical details, the musculature of the torso, the drawing of the ribs, the narrowing of the waist, and the roundness of the belly. Here again, two Vajrapani borrowing their type to Zeus or Jupiter. The rendering of the body, clothes, and face is more realistic, more elegant. Furthermore, one can see with this representation of Jupiter holding the thunderbolt on the Arc of Trajan, the similarity between their famous attributes, the Vajra for Vajrapani and the thunderbolt for Jupiter. The symbolic resemblances certainly explain why Gandharan artists first brought the figure of Vajrapani and the Jupiter together and wished to borrow from this exotic iconography of the Greco-Roman god to represent the Buddha companion. To some extent, by analogy or form between their attributes, even if it's not only the only reason, the type of Heracles carrying the mass has also been reused and reworked by Gandharan artists to represent Vajrapani. Moreover, Heracles shares this particularity with Vajrapani that he is at times represented young and birdless, as other old and birdly. But this is important to note that another aesthetic features, which this time has no equivalent on our formal Vajrapani, also caught the attention of the artist. This is the Leonte, the skin of the Nemean lion Heracles killed during the first of his 12 levels. And it seems to have been an aesthetic attribute particularly appreciated by Gandharan artists. Vajrapani Heracles is the type that has been most studied and commented on by scholars. On this fragment of relief, Vajrapani is almost naked, only wearing a dhoti arranged in panties. He is covered with a leonte, covering his head, knocked around the neck, and the paws resting symmetrically on his chest. This representation of Heracles is very typical in Western world. Here is, for example, a marble statue group of Heracles and his son Telephus. On the relief, Vajrapani holds a Vajra with his right hand at tight height, while he holds or leans on a sword protected in its scabbard. How should we interpret this word? What was it, a clumsiness on the part of the artist who did not fully understand the reference? This addition is difficult to interpret and deserves further investigation. A strong Hellenistic heritage is revealed on the Vajrapani in the guise of Heracles, discovered in the same niche as the Arititike we saw earlier at the opposite corner. Vajrapani face exudes gravity. He is bearded and wearing a mustache and short curls. He sits on a rock, his torso pivoting to prevent infiltrators and his face turned to the Buddha. With one hand, he holds the Vajra on his knee. He is dressed with a leonte, knocked at the hips and covering his thighs, while the head of the animal lay back on his shoulders. The Heracles who lent this type to this Vajrapani was identified by Tarzi. It is about the reappearance of a type that goes back to the Heracles Epitrapesios of Lysippus, and more particularly to its Greco-Bactrian variant that we found on Epidemus coins. The depiction of the anatomy, whether in proportion or musculature, the flexibility of the garment, and the serious expression of the face make it a masterpiece of Ada's art and more widely a major work of the late Hellenistic school in Afghanistan. When I was preparing this talk, I was reviewing my photos and I found this curious Vajrapani of which I know no other example. As usual, holding the Vajra is dressed in with a tunic tightened at the waist. But here we can see he wears an uncommon dress with these. I looked for parallels to this address on Hellenistic art and my attention was caught by this terracotta figurine and this marble relief. Dionysus here wears the Dionysian festival crown decorated with 3 flowers. This type of crown, variant of the ivy wreath, is moreover found on various characters related to these festivities. The headdress worn by Hercules on this relief of King Antiochus I of Commagene is more like that worn by Vajrapani, consisting in a band decorated with leaves. It is not the first time that we observe this sharing or exchange of attributes between the two Greek gods, for example, on the return of Nyssa, where Dionysus wears the Leonte of Heracles. Perhaps Vajrapani hairstyling was inspired by the Dionysian festival crown. In that case, where the Gandharan artist inspired more by an Hercules model than by a Dionysus model, maybe through numismatic, it is hard to say. Unfortunately, I didn't have enough time to do the research properly for coins with this iconography in our geographical area. Nevertheless, we know that this motif was used in Western world, as we can see from this statue of Thebes, showing a bearded Dionysus wearing the ivy breath. Whatever the case, it seems that the transmission, the Hellenistic motif of the leafed crown caught the artist's attention, and tracing the transmission of this motif through the Near East to Central Asia could be the subject of a whole study. To conclude with this leaves band, let us note that as in the case of the Leonte, this aesthetic accessory has no equivalent on the former Vajrapani. Let us go back to a younger type, perhaps inspired by the god Hermes, Eros, or even by young athletes or putti. On these two reliefs, Vajrapani holds the Vajra against his shoulder, barely naked, wearing in simple dhoti in one case, only an uttariya in the other. The round head, the full cheeks, the short curls. On the right, he has a crouping face, especially in contrast with the five monks with thin and elongated faces. Here is a rare example, at least to my knowledge, of a Vajrapani inspired by the figure of a satyr, maybe even by a young Bacchus. The pointed ear, the slightly brachycephalic head, the slight smile, not too wide in Gandharan version, the smile showing the teeth being reserved for evil genies and demons. All these features make this figure an original and remarkable Vajrapani, which would have been difficult to identify without his unfailing attribute, the Vajra. I added a Hada head, which I suspect is a Vajrapani satyr for all these reasons: elongated ears, brachycephalic head, slight smile. If it wasn't for the soft, smiling expression and the absence of a sneer when showing teeth, the previous details could have been found on a demon face. But the kind, almost loving expression definitely does not fit this identification. Who else but Vajrapani would have been given this rather special attribute? I don't know. I don't have any other idea, but I'm open to any suggestion. Let us go back to the site of Tapeshutor in Ada, this time in Nijvi 3. As previously, the scene represents the first summon. The center is occupied by a monumental Buddha surrounded by several characters, among which Vajrapani in the guise of Apollo or a young Hellenistic king or hero. Again, a strong Western heritage is revealed. He is dressed in a peplos held on his shoulders by two round brooches. His long curly hair adorned by a diadem frames a birdless but virile face marked by pathos. Frowning eyebrows, troubled eyes, and sullen pout are reminiscent of the tormented expression found, for example, in the works of Lysippus, Scopas, and Praxiteles, and more widely in Hellenistic art. This figure has also been compared to some portraits of Alexander the Great. Let us now turn to more theoretical consideration. We said that the first scholars to study Vajrapani noted that his physical description in the text was not revealed. The Lalita Vistara, to name one example, gave only summary information about the character. It is stated that this yaksha derives its origin from a yaksha clan named Guyakas. It would therefore seem that it is as a yaksha that the artist first conceived him. However, more recently, Professor Tanabe sets out an interesting theory considering the figure of the Vajrapani Heracles, which is the borrowed appearance that has been preferred by Gandharan artists. According to him, Vajrapani might never have been considered by Gandharan artists and devotees as a yaksha, a fallen class often shown as naked and humiliated, or like monsters, as we shall see later. He notes that in the scene preceding the Great Departure, it is the god Indra who carries the Vajra, and wonders whether it is not this god, perhaps too Indian in the eyes of Gandharan artists, who might have been replaced by a Gandharan Vajrapani, a new version of Vajrapani, also far removed from the Vajrapani Yaksha or Goyakas of the text. Moreover, from Tanabe's point of view, and I agree with this part of his demonstration, it was an analogy of personality and legend between Vajrapani and Heracles that came into play in this preference. To use this word, the bellicose, quasi-martial, and apotropaic character, in addition to the aspect of best traveler and protector for travelers. This short, naturally not exhaustive examination of the various types of Vajrapani of Hellenistic appearance allows us to establish several points. First of all, the inspiration of physical type is wide. Zeus, Jupiter, Heracles, Eros, Putti, Bacchus, Satyr. Hellenistic king may be Apollo Alexander. Furthermore, in some cases, it seems that the rapprochement was made by analogy in the symbolism and in the form of a major attribute. The Vajra for Vajrapani, the thunderbolt of Zeus, and the mass of Heracles. Finally, in the special case of Vajrapani Heracles, Tanabe's arguments are convincing regarding the reason of the rapprochement of the two characters, namely their dimension of guardian and traveler. But are we faced with the creation of a new personality, which is neither Hercule nor the former Yaksha Vajrapani, but a new character, a creation of Gandhara, who seemed more appropriate to the artist to represent the Buddha's companion, as Tanabe suggests. The fact that some new attributes without ancient equivalent have been added and precisely borrowed to Heracles, the Leonte, and maybe the Dionysian festival crown, could go toward an original conception. That being said, the borrowings on the appearance of Heracles, even if it is preferred, is not the only one, as we have seen, and the variety of themes of inspiration nuances this idea, as Vajrapani Heracles is not the only personality version chosen to represent Vajrapani. To conclude on this character, one can say that under the variety of features and clauses in which he appears, it is his attribute, the Vajra, that which serve as a reference for the faithful devotees in the past as for us today. I believe this instrument takes precedence over all its appearances, for it is a symbolic instrument of its master, magical power. He is the bearer of the Vajra. What it remains for artists and devotees is the protector of the Buddha, whatever appearance he takes. We will come back to this concern on the conclusion. Let us now consider the next figures we are going to discuss, namely that of the genies with flowers. These ornamental deities, throwing handfuls of flower at the Buddha, are recurrent characters in Buddhist scene. First, let us see its canonical Gandhara version. Genie with flowers appears on most of the scenes of Buddha's life. I take the example of two reliefs representing the first Saman and the image of King Nagakalika. In the upper register, in the skies, Deva and Jenny's rain flower petals on the Buddha from events. Here is an example of Jenny with flower discovered in Tapaikafaria in Ada. The fine and delicate features of this figure add to its feminine character. The face of Indian type is surrounded by twisted curl, a kind of short English curls. The genie wears a crown, which seems to be encrusted with gems and supported a central pearl. The upper part of the hair is wrapped in a turban, arranged in several knots and falling in a wider part on the left in the manner of a novice breath. The earlobes are deformed. In Guimet Museum, this head is rendered on a bust. A wide torque-like necklace adorns the naked torso, clad in a finely executed Uttarasanga. With his left hand, he holds a flap of it to create a kind of touch with flower. This bust of a genie with flowers is one of the most famous species among those found in Ada by Jules Barthou and was the subject of an article by Alfred Fouché. It was discovered in a nearby chapel of Tapakalan. At the back of this chaitya, on a platform, stood a walking Buddha, estimated to be about 2.2 meter height, surrounded by two other statues of 80 centimeters to 1 meter, placed in each corner. On the walls, placed symmetrically to the genie with flowers, was another bust, an orant in Anjali Mudra, which collapsed when it was being cast. Ancient texts report that some gods, devas, and genies coming from heavens only manifested themselves halfway up the body, which is probably what the artist wanted to illustrate here. The genie drew with his right hand, now lost, a whole supply of flowers contained in the sinus of his uttariya, held by his other hand in order to rain petals on the Buddha. Shirtless, he wears a necklace made of a large chain with an oval medallion set in it. Although this work is of exceptional quality, it does not appear to be the work of a particular identifiable genie. In this setting, he belongs to the cohort of devotees, of helpers who populate the scene of Buddha's legend. He is a genie among many others, a Devaputra, a son of God, a divine being of some kind. He has no lakshana, a sign or distinctive attribute that could classify him among the great gods. His role as a flower throwing orant is always lent to simple genies. The genie with flower had been compared to no less famous Hellenistic figures, the Antinous as Agathos Daimon of Vertumnus, the Zephyr of the Tower of the Wind in Athens, certain portrait of Alexander the Great, and some Lysippus works. For a long time, it has been questioned whether this connection was simply a meeting of minds or direct imitation. Through a strong demonstration, Fouché rightly answers this question by explaining that what counts more than the posture and the gesture is the intention. In this case, it differs completely. In the Hellenistic world, this posture would be an allegory for the spring season. In Buddhist mythology, it is the common gesture of the Deva to honor the Buddha Shakyamuni. The Hellenistic character is obvious, supple and symmetrical arrangement of the hair curls, nervous modeling of the eyes and lips, perfect oval of the face. But here, the artistic influence ends because from the body onwards, nothing is Greek. The shawl is Indian, as are the flower, apparently jasmine. The jewelry is Indian, bracelet on the wrist, medallion held by chains on the chest, and of course, the earlobes are deformed so that the pious donor can put real earrings in them. These purely Indian details show once again that we are faced with a transformation of identity in order to put the image at the service of the Buddhist tradition. The abandonment of the initial personality is corroborated by the fact that the Hellenistic appearance is here transposed not to an individualized character like Vajrapani, Panchika, or Ariti. The artist has borrowed the feature of a Greek hero or god and applied it to a simply orant among thousands, abandoning his original identity altogether. Let us examine the example of another unindividualized character without a personality on his own, taking the Hellenistic appearance. Here is a schist relief representing the renunciation, also called Sleep of the Woman, episode preceding the Great Departure. Framing the scene, leaning on their spears, female guards are responsible for guarding the private quarters of the palace. Such female guardians are thus also present on Maya's dream scene. On this example, one female god is represented as goddess Athena. She wore the Attic helmet and a chiton tied under her chest, here held by two brooches on her shoulder. She was leaning on a spear, today partially broken, and in this case again, the initial identity is completely set aside. It is the motif of the warrior woman with an helmet that has been retained by the artist. Let us continue our review with an examination of some genies and demons, indispensable characters among Buddhist cohorts. Yaksha, Gandharva, Naga, Garuda, Apshura, Apsara. All these hybrid creatures are the guardian genies of the entrance of the cardinal points, the genies of the air, of the waters, and the forest, and so on. It must be admitted that it is sometimes very difficult to distinguish between genies and demons. Indeed, according to the text, these characters could be sometimes evil, sometimes beneficial, protector, or calamity, depending on their mood. In their evil aspect, they are cannibals, and the popular imagination tends to attribute them prominent canines, bulging eyes, and bristly hair. Through the creation of the demons and genies images, the artists give free rein to their imagination. They take the liberty of representing them with increasingly individualized or caricatured faces. Many of these moody demonic characters are among the protagonists for training the members of Mara's army during this attack. Some demons, animal hybrid, vomit their luck, tears off their tongue. One stick out a bovine tongue with tentacles protrude from its mouth and one of its eyes. Other demons with human faces bear the demonic mark, sharp teeth, flaming hair, one tear off his head. Some of them are grimaced with a tormented expression, reminiscent of tumultuous expression in Hellenistic schools of art. And finally, I wanted to show you this character with a reptilian attitude, who seems to sneak in with evil intent and who could represent the tempter Mara himself. Yaksha are the genies of the air. In the Buddhist imagination, they form a rather ill-famed caste of demigod, as despised as they are feared because their deplorable tastes were known. Whoever wished to satisfy them had to offer them meat and alcohol. These unindividualized minor demons often took on the character of boogeyman or ogre. However, under the influence of the Buddha, these ferocious beings become harmless and even helpful. They are part of the divine guard that watches over the Buddha. Their role is mostly decorative along the bases, on the surface of pilasters, and as atlas-like figures. Here are some yaksha in the form of atlas-like figures from Tapaika Faria and Ada. Almost naked, only wearing the dhoti, they take various positions, crouching, cross-legged on one knee, to support the platform that once supported a stupa. On stupa 22, they are represented like young, unbodied athletes. Their tormented expression is again reminiscent of Hellenistic art. On stupa 20, appearances are most varied, and we find again the figure of Zeus, or maybe Atlas himself. Gandharva are celestial minor deva, sometimes confused with yaksha. They are winged and also take the form of Atlas-like figures. Here are some examples from Jamal Ghali, where the Hellenistic touch is particularly strong. The artist borrowed to the appearance of Zeus, Atlas, to figure Gandharva. And to make a link with our previous study on Vajrapani, this yaksha Atlas in the guise of Heracles, wearing the leonte knocked around the neck and posed on the torso. This tends to nuance, at least for this instance, the idea that Vajrapani was never considered as a yaksha. So all these minor deities figures, although their representation are marked by foreign influences, are indeed derived from Buddhist mythology. The Atlas-like figures adorning the base of Gandhara Stupa are the same yaksha that decorated the pillar and jambs of Amaravati and Sanchi, for example. I would like to make an aside to mention to you some consideration about the symbolism of this decoration. We have hazarded an hypothesis about the representation of the yaksha as warrior of Mara's army in the form of Atlas-like figures on the stupa. Referring to the Lalita Vitara Sutra passage describing the fight between the god of pleasure and the Buddha, we know that cohorts of sons of Mara, his warrior demons, successively submitted to the power of Shakyamuni. In this context, the representation of Mara's armies on stupa in the form of Atlas-like figures does not seem innocuous and purely decorative. Their situation of submission in the architectural role of support elements for the stupa itself decorated to the glory of the Buddha with relief celebrating his life or with the multiplication of his images could symbolically recall the victory of the Buddha on this army. And so the decoration of stupa would symbolically recall the enlightenment episode. But let us leave this consideration and move on to the representation of the bhikshu, the Buddhist monks, and the Brahman. Here we are not talking about an identity transformation. Hellenistic inspiration does not manifest itself in the borrowing of figures, appearance, or characteristic of recognizable deities or figures from the Western world, but in the style and aesthetic rendering. For example, the portrait of this elderly monk is full of realism. The modeler has accentuated his features with a nervous end. His slightly brachycephalic head is shaved. His face is furrowed with deep wrinkles. They crossed his forehead, mark the crow's feet at the corner of his eyes, hollow out his cheeks, and tag his cheekbones. His frowning eyebrows and the pout of his mouth express contrariety. The realism of this wrinkled face recalls, for example, the rendering of the face of Senator Brutus. Here is a portrait of a middle-aged monk, mutilated. All we can make out of his face is his drooping arch, his wrinkled cheek, and his mouth, animated by a grimace of severity. We encounter this early expression and this remarkable aesthetic realism, for example, on a bust of the Old Man of Otripoli. This Brahman with a tormented look echoes the work of Scopas, Lysippus, and Praxiteles. It can be compared to the Atlantean Silenus in the Athens theatre and to the bust of Socrates. Half bald, bearded, and mustached, his long hair is gathered in a parietal bow. His expression reflects pain and pathos. This Brahman, once called the Jesus of Ada, has been linked to the figures of Christ in European medieval churches. He is bearded and mustached. His hair is long, falling over his ears with enlarged lobes. One of his locks is twisted into a small bun on his forehead. His face is young, thin, with high cheekbones. His eyes are deep, his mouth half open, and he is dressed in a kind of short-sleeved tunic that seems to be cut out of leather. And one can notice that his sketches a gesture that has often been compared to that of the Alexandrian Appropriation, the Greco-Egyptian deity. His left hand is raised to the level of his torso, palm towards the sky, and his right hand is raised to the level of his face, his index fingers pointed toward his mouth. This Brahman finally is inspired by the type of the Greek philosopher of mature age and serious expression. He wears his hair short and wavy, without a bun, a mustache, and a beard, which is separated by two volutes. He wears an exomid held by a tie on the shoulder and leaving the arm there. Over this is wrapped in a second dress, Nimation or Tarasanga, which he holds with his left arm. Once again, we see that the borrowing of Western themes is accompanied by the abandonment of the original context, and that the artist transposes them to represent the monks and Brahman of Gambhara. Finally, I would like to address these fascinating cases, which is not strictly speaking the result of an identity transformation, but which relates directly to the problem of aesthetic borrowings. This view was put forward by Alfred Fouché. You are all aware that the ancient school of Buddhist art in India had already staged certain jatakas, the past lives of the Buddha, and certain famous episodes in his legend. However, it was in Gandhara, in contact with Hellenistic art, that his anthropomorphic image first took shape. For Indian artists have preferred an iconic representation of the Blessed One by evoking him through his symbol, the empty throne, the Dharmakakra or wheel of law, the turban, the Buddha padas, his footprints, and so on. According to the texts, the Buddha was, like his bhikshu, clothed in the Samgati, the monastic mantle, and he wore, spread over his person, the 32 Lakshana, or signs, of the Mahapurusha, the great man. In other words, the Buddha corresponded physically to the Indian ideal type of human beauty, certainly fixed long along the birth of Buddhism. According to Fouché, it is possible that by analogy, artists inspire themselves with the face of Apollo, representing the ideal type of Western beauty, to represent the Buddha. Foreign influence may have brought the Greek profile of the nose, the firm design of the eyes and mouth, and the wavy hair to the earliest Buddha. Indian tradition left the shape and placement of the Ushnisha, the bun or cranial protuberance, the Urna, the tuft of hair between the eyebrows, the distended hair lobes, reminding us that he once wore heavy earrings when he was a prince before renouncing the world, the rounding of the face, and then later the schematization of the curls of hair. In sum, Fouché tells us he is a combination of the Indian ideal with the Greek ideal, a mixture of Apollo and Purusha. In the introduction, we ask the following question: what determined the artist to choose the figure of an Hellenistic, the features of an Hellenistic figure to represent a Buddhist character. We said above that these adaptations were not equivalent to the phenomenon of interpretation. Through these few examples, it appears that characters were most often brought together by analogy of symbolism or form of their attribute and posture, but also, even if more rarely, by analogy of function, legend, or epiclesis. This is the case for Penchika and Ariti, whose appearance has been strongly Hellenized and whose attributes have been adapted, the purse or cup instead of the spear, or replaced by their Western equivalents, the cornucopia instead of the children, and who nevertheless retain their dimension as dispensers of wealth, prosperity, and richness. In the spatial case of Vajrapani Heracles, the physique that was preferred to represent the Buddha companion, it is both the analogy of form in their attributes and similarity between their legend that has been considered as demonstrated by Tanabe. Let us note that even if we go further in following his idea, considering we are in front of the creation of an original character, it would not be once again a question of interpretation. According to Tanabe, Gandharan artists may have felt that Indra and Vajrapani Yaksha were not suitable enough to represent the Buddha's companion. They would then have sought a more suitable equivalent, more suited to his role as guardian and traveling companion. So if it is the case, then once again, and even if it seems paradoxical, the borrowing to Heracles' personality would have been motivated by the artist's desire to serve the Buddhist faith in the best possible way. In addition, artists have drawn inspiration for many other physical types to represent Vajrapani, again by comparisons between attributes, the thunderbolt of Zeus, but also by aesthetic taste of representations of deities and Western figures, Hermes, Eros, Satyr, Alexander the Great. This appetence for Hellenistic themes is illustrated by the adaptation of this appearance of Western deities to undifferentiated character from Buddhist legends, genies with flowers, female guard, which is accompanied by an abandonment of the initial identity. In the same way, the representation of genies and demons, as well as bhikshu and brahman, bears this mark in style and aesthetic rendering, especially in regard with the tormented expression reminiscent of tumultuous expression of Hellenistic school of art. The borrowing is again characterized by an abandonment of the original context and a transposition in Buddhist mythology. Whatever the degree of metamorphosis that this character from Buddhist legend, the artist adapts all these components in order to put them there the Buddhist face. The attributes, the Vajrapani, the symbol of abundance for Penchika and Ariti, the helmet of the female guard, the postures, the gesture of genuine flower or the decorative stance of the Atlas-like figures, the clothing and adornments, the shawl, the turban, the jewelry, but also, and they should not be forgotten, the iconographic context of these works, the other figures in the scene, such as the great Buddha seated between Vajrapani Heracles and Aritike, for example, or Vajrapani above the tutelary couple representation. All of these elements help to create a context of purely Buddhist tradition. This is what the artist retains. They borrow the foreign aesthetic and iconographic details that appeal to them, then strip them of their meaning to clothe them with a Buddhist intention. As Fouché said, this is what counts above all in this art. It is indeed what translates the artist's intention and allows the faithful to identify the scene and the characters, whatever the style chosen to represent them. What the artists do not retain, apart perhaps from the case of Vajrapani Heracles, is the identity of the character from whom it draws inspiration. His original personality, his legend, the symbolism of his own attributes. The artist diverts them, appropriates them, and integrates them as aesthetic elements in the spiritual context of the Buddhist legend. As far as stylistic and aesthetic borrowing is concerned, we can feel through their works the artist's appetite for freedom, their desire to experimentation and creation, their taste for drama, pathos, tormented figure and poses, but also their taste of the aesthetic nudity and question of realistic rendering of the body, and finally their appeal for morbid, horrific art and portrait caricature. Certain foreign motifs or decorative attributes seduce their eyes and even more their arts because they choose to draw inspiration from them and to add their aesthetic quality to the beauty of the whole. It was with this purely Buddhist intention that the artists choose iconographic foreign elements to enrich and embellish their work. As we said in introduction, Gandharan art is a sacred art and its expression was unconditionally in the service of the geography of the Buddha. Thank you.
Oh, wow, thank you, Dr. Alessandra Marin. And well, it's very inspiring, fabulous, and elaborate sharing of showing us different representations of different character that's popular in Gandhara regions and the comparison between the Buddhist character and Hellenistic character. Well, I can see that there's a lot of question in the Q&A